Hello and welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the second to last webinar of the year. The next webinar will be on the 5th of December. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this webinar. So today we will have a fascinating discussion with three of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse's brilliant PhDs. We're going to talk about COP and what it means for planetary health equity. Before we get into it, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. And I think I can speak for the Hothouse PhDs when I say we wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, and recognize any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and our wider region. And we would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. So without further ado, let me get into introducing our fantastic panel. We have Gio, who is a laureate PhD candidate in the PHE Hothouse, and her work really investigates the research agendas of health philanthropies, and then the implications that these agendas have for the achievement of planetary health equity. And I think she's the only member of the panel that has training as a scientist. And I know that Gio has worked with various nonprofit organizations focused on global health and sustainability. Roxana is another laureate PhD candidate, and her research examines food regulation and means of curbing greenwashing, specifically in ultra-processed foods in the European Union. And Roxana also has experience working for UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And last but certainly not least, we have Cynthia, who is doing a dual PhD at Laval University as well as at RegNet. And her work focuses on the role of non-state actors in global governance. And she has done fascinating work on everything from space governance to health governance. So we've got a brilliant panel today. I'll just give a little bit of context before we get into the discussion around COP. So for those of you who are not climate nerds, COP is the Conference of the Parties and refers to the UNFCCC Convention on Climate Change as their meeting on climate. And COP is the primary decision-making body of the UNFCCC. So it includes representatives of all the parties, i.e. the countries that have agreed to participate in and be bound by the UNFCCC. And COP generally takes place every year and is an opportunity to negotiate new measures and to review the various states' progress against the overall goals of the UNFCCC in terms of limiting climate change. And generally, each COP agrees to a statement or a binding agreement, which is publicly released at the end of the conference. So at COP28 in 2023, the parties agreed to the UAE consensus. I'm not going to go through the whole consensus, but some of the highlights were that it offered new specific targets on tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. It recognized the need to significantly scale adaptation finance to meet the urgent and evolving needs, particularly of developing economies. And it made a reference to transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems. So why are we interested in COP? Well, all of those things will have implications for planetary health equity. The shape and the speed of the energy transition will have implications for economic equity, our ability to combat climate change, as well as the health and well-being of people in a stable ecosystem. Okay, so to get us started, I'm just going to ask the panel, what do you think the relevance of COP is to your research agendas? Maybe we'll start with Gio.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see so many people joining us today. Yes, as Nick said at the beginning when he introduced me, I'm doing a PhD on philanthropic organizations. I'm interested basically in what they fund in research and why. And the reason for that is because those private actors are quite prominent in and quite powerful within global health governance. And the fact that obviously they're involved in the decision making also through the research that they support means that they're an interesting actor to look into. And the reason for that is that research, and probably most of the people in this call will agree, can inform or should, as we researcher will probably say, policy making, right? And so when it comes to also COP, this kind of higher level decision making, we want research to be, at the forefront of the decisions of policymakers. So what is kind of funded or not funded in research obviously has then an implication of what kind of policy we put out there, and that can have trickle down effects on society. So for me, the relevance of COP in relation to my research is really about what's the role of research in there. But more specific when it comes to philanthropic organization, I think it's also the fact that those actors are quite present at COP. So some are very engaged in the events that are happening during the 2 weeks that COP is running, even hosting some events. And we saw that at COP28, for example, with one of the organizations like the Wellcome Trust, which is a big foundation based in the UK, co-organizing some of the sessions. And so they are really present in this kind of space. And that obviously has repercussion on the decision making more broadly. The other thing I think that is quite interesting going forward in relation to the last COP is that COP28, and I will talk a bit more about that later, was the COP where we had health as a prominent topic of discussion for the first time. There was a health recognized day during COP28. And that meant there were a few things that came out of that. But one of the interesting things from the philanthropy side was that Wellcome Trust and the Rockefeller Foundation actually launched this call for a climate and health founder coalition. And so we don't know yet where this is going to go, but definitely will have some repercussions for future COPs, but also for climate and health outcomes. So that's why I see like the interest, even though I don't focus on COP specifically in my research, but why it's important to keep an eye on what is happening in that space.
Lovely, thank you, Gio. Cynthia.
Thank you. That builds up quite nicely as you on what you said. As you said, Nick, I focus on public-private partnerships. So I look a lot at different types of actors and how they get involved in global governance of public good. And so when I think of public good, I think of things that are meant to be enjoyed by everyone and that aren't appropriable, such as the environment, health, the outer space, air, international seas, and so on. And there are things that have typically, as I focus on global governance, in global governance studies, that typically have been traditionally approached in silos, but that through the concept of planetary health, it really helps us pin down how enjoying these different public goods is inherently intertwined. And so what I find fascinating through my PhD, when I reflect on things like COP, is that today public-private partnerships have become absolutely central in our responses to global governance problems of that scale that go beyond the country level. And an example of that was the importance of the COVAX facility in the global response to COVID-19 pandemic. And so as we increasingly rely on these partnerships to address global challenges, it really opens a big door and grants significant power to the shareholders of these partnerships on the international scene. And as our governance of public good increasingly depends on them, it really is essential that they face institutional checks and balances, which typically public organizations have to face, but they don't necessarily have to at the global level, or not to, it's very contested. And so, well, this is what my thesis look at. I argue that together must get a better understanding of how much the role has expanded and what drove this expansion. But when I think about COP and what I do in the meantime is that it's also important to understand how these actors are dealt with by public institutions that are existing, because the non-state actors have very often vested interest in maintaining the systems that create these governance problems to start with. And so public institutions like COP are key places where reforms that tackle the core systemic issues can stem from. This is why doing my work through this planetary health lens makes a clear link and relevance for COP for me, because again, the governance and the enjoyment of the environment and health is interconnected, and so the governance dynamic around them at the global level must interact too. And although the efficiency of COP has been criticized, and rightfully so in different ways, and maybe we'll get the chance to talk about that a little bit more, it remains a state-of-the-art state-based effort for climate change. And so it would be really relevant to see what is happening there or not in terms of planetary health. And so, yeah, I'm really hoping to see to what extent, as Gio touched on, health was included in the last COP, but it was very, very superficial. However, COP would be a really, really interesting place to see some of those systemic reforms happen. And to give a concrete example of that, there's a work that just came out from Dipali Mathura where she talked about the unequal and systematic exposure to toxicity of certain population, and more precisely in developing countries, and even within these countries and more marginal groups, is an environmental and public health crisis that is inherently rooted in and essential to the survival of the global capitalist system. But then tackling such an issue would require global reforms of the intensive agricultural practices and management of industrial waste and so on. And so that would really challenge the systems that the private sector in developed countries really rely on. And so COP is extremely important in the work that we're doing, and those reflections of the interaction of the global scene.
Absolutely. It always gets my juices going talking about complex interdependence. And this is an opportunity to shamelessly promote some of the work that we've done. We've recently published a paper in Environmental Research Letters that really looks at the inclusion of planetary health equity relevant language in NDC statements. Now that plug is out of the way, let's turn to Roxana.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Indeed, planetary health is also at the core of my research project. As you kindly mentioned when you introduced me, I'm interested in greenwashing in ultra-processed foods and how we can improve the regulation around green claims in these foods. Greenwashing is a problem because it's a deceptive way to communicate environmental efforts, when in reality, these efforts might not be as accurate, might be misleading or completely false. And what we see in the food system is that there is a particular niche or category of foods that is an opportunity for greenwashing to emerge. And this category is ultra-processed foods, this type of food-like products that are full of additives, of flavorings, preservatives, and so on, to make them compelling to eat, to taste, to touch, to feel. They are massively produced and industrialized types of elements. Most of them are coming from multi or transnational corporations. So we have a vested interest of the corporate sector there in maintaining ultra-processed foods on the markets. The science tells us ultra-processed foods are detrimental to human health. They're deeply linked to diseases such as cardiovascular diseases, different types of cancers, and so forth. But what the novelty is in what we see, and this is also reflective of the next summit in COP that will take place in Baku in Azerbaijan in less than 25 days, is the fact that there is a new opportunity for ultra-processed foods that are already detrimental to human health to enter the market for green foods. And through greenwashing, through this portrayal of services, practices, and products that in theory are good or better for the environment compared to their counterparts, we see an influence and a dominance of the corporate sector. And thinking about my PhD research and then comparing it to the trends and expectations of the next COP, I see there at least three strands or three topical approaches that are relevant. The first one is regulation. The second one is greenwashing per se. And the third one is about foods. Now, Conference of the Parties, COPs meetings are a platform for negotiation and debates. They are a great opportunity to review the progress that is needed to limit climate change. And this is also a great opportunity for new frameworks to be built on regulatory environments, and an opportunity to prioritize sustainability as well as the language around it. So the language around how sustainability is measured and portrayed and all of these green claims. It would also be a powerful signal at the global level that countries can take back and implement within their national legislation and regulatory regimes. The second aspect is greenwashing per se, as a concept, as a danger, as a threat. We know that an upcoming deadline is on the way when it comes to the nationally determined contributions of each countries of the member states. The next deadline is in February 2025, when the next cycle of the Paris ratchet mechanism is taking place. So this is really an opportunity for countries to revisit, revamp, and increase their ambitions within their nationally determined contributions. And because of that, there is also a great danger for greenwashing, because there is a huge pressure to conform and also to overstate the benefits of specific environmental efforts, and perhaps bank down or overshadow some of the limits or the caveats. Last but not least, we also might consider the carbon credit systems and the trading mechanisms and the relationship with greenwashing there, because there is a huge debate on how carbon markets and the trading systems are being measured, how double counting takes place. And again, double counting would be a prerequisite for greenwashing. And this is something, again, that is worth looking for and observing for the next COP. Last but not least, foods are finally on the table. Agriculture and foods have been neglected for so many years throughout the COP sessions. And finally, last year in UAE, we had the first day on foods. Just like Gio mentioned, we had the very first day dedicated to health. This was led by the UN Agency on Food and Agriculture, FAO. And it concluded with a declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action, which is huge. So finally, the solutions that anyways we're tackling for food and agriculture can be solutions for climate change. And this is a beautiful linkage to planetary health equity. How can we manage to feed growing populations affordable, accessible, nutritious foods, as well as limit our impact on the climate, on the environment?
That's fantastic. I mean, I think all three of your interventions really highlighted how a planetary health equity lens provides us with the necessary analytical leverage to really tackle the intertwined challenges of climate change, economic inequality, and their associated public health challenges. I was going to ask Cynthia, what role do you expect different actors, whether they be IOs, states, non-state actors, to play at this COP?
Well, to build on what I've already said, for several private actors that contribute to global governance, their organizational survival often depends on maintaining the systems at the base that are the root cause of several of the governance problems that we're talking about. And so, for instance, the Gates Foundation, who I'm sure Gio can talk more about, but gets its wealth from Microsoft, whose organizational survival is rooted in the foundations of the neoliberalism of the 80s and the 90s. Or MasterCard, who's one of the biggest shareholders of some of the global health public-private partnerships, is another example of this, and also has rooted interest in the climate change crisis. And so it's very likely, for instance, that they'll push for superficial interventions that don't challenge the core systems rooting the planetary health crisis. And so in this regard, I'm absolutely expecting non-state actors that have gained tremendous power in global governance sphere through their intervention, their well-doing, who have gained somewhat kind of an informal seat at the table to definitely use it and be there and certainly try to exercise pressure and shun away systemic reform proposal or dilute them as much as they can. And so this links a little bit to what I did previously when I look at the influence of private actors in global sphere of global health, but basically it is their stronghold. The fact they have the capacity to be there at every panel, they have the capacity to send an army of people to be there. COP has so many different panels, so many discussions, so many side events, but they have the capacity to send someone everywhere at all times to make sure that they're always there to filter information, dilute ideas, make sure that they counterfact. And so yeah, it's been very clearly reported this is their stronghold, and I'm very much expecting to see that. And it's likely that they're going to be supporting more like band-aid solutions, or certainly solutions that allow them to survive at the lowest cost in the way that they business as usual, right? But also history and research has been very clear that we shouldn't only expect them to be active in doing that during COP in the side events and just in the hallways and all that, but also it's clear that they're right now already lobbying their government to propose and support these band-aid solutions or superficial solutions. So I know that what we should expect from actors has started already within developed countries. And so I'm really excited to see, well, I have pessimism and optimism regarding what to expect from developed countries. On the one hand, it'll be interesting to see if they stand up to their industry and take significant decisions towards planetary health equity. But the order of priorities set by the presidency for COP already put finance and trade at the top of, and so that basically reiterates what we've been discussing at the Hothouse, which is again business as usual. How can we maintain the growth model? How can we maintain the system, but just make it more sustainable, which we know is not enough. And on the other hand, it'll be interesting to see how much accountability climate change perpetrating states will take, and all the, because we know at last COP there was an important development of that in that regard with the loss and damage fund, when they started to take some accountability in the unequal responsibility and distribution of effects of climate change, but still we're far from enough substantial climate responsibility and accountability from developed states. But there is a bit of hope building on that. And also we know that when we're reflecting on IO, that it's not going to happen for this COP, but it's when the International Court of Justice is going to render its opinion on climate responsibility. And we know that, you know, we've had legal cases at the country level tying climate responsibility with the responsibility to protect of states and linking, that's a direct link with global health. That's definitely going to have an impact, hopefully, on COP and really give some leverage to planetary health lands in events like COP. But yeah, so that leads me to reflecting on other IOs. That's what I mentioned in the beginning. I really hope that there will be some kind of support in creating organic, better articulations between the different silo, traditional, multilateral institutions, because I really believe the public institutions have a role in leading the way for those systemic reforms, because I don't think it's going to happen from the private sector, at least not the industrial sector. But the reality, and as you know, and you've talked about in your own work, Nick, IOs have a tendency to challenge each other for leadership. There's leadership because that's where they get their budget from, right? They need to have a claim to leadership to justify member states giving them budget. And so I don't know if IGOs are going to support each other in these articulation or pull the bed sheet on their side to make sure to secure that leadership and budget. But it'll be interesting to see. Also the increasing, I'm curious to see how the WHO will be present now that there's been this signal at the last COP that COP is taking health more seriously. So that will be interesting, but I can't finish without talking about civil society delegations. And I'm going to put a very hopeful note. They're always stronger, better organized, and they have a developed, that also has been reported to me, they have a developed diplomatic savoir-faire that is sometimes way better than some of the major corporations in even some countries. So I'm really hopeful, and more importantly, they're backed by science. And so I'm really hopeful that they're going to keep leveraging their voice and that they're going to be able to build on those building blocks that have started towards planetary health equity and really push it forward. But I'm curious towards COP. I'm not sure about what's going to happen. And I feel like that's a good way. I feel like not everything is already decided. And I feel like it's essential to keep some hope, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that really ties into some of Gio's work, in that at the last year we saw health being included in COP for the first time in history, and we have the Climate and Health Declaration being signed by more than 120 countries. And I was wondering, Gio, could you comment on the relevance of this declaration and what is expected at this year's COP and going forward, COP 30, 31, 32?
Yeah, so thank you, Nick. I think, yeah, kind of also reflecting a bit of what you all have kind of highlighted very well. I think, yeah, last year COP was the first time that health was kind of more prominent, but as Cynthia highlighted, again, you know, maybe not going deep into actually exploring health in a more holistic way. So there was still quite a focus on, I would say, the physical and present impact on health, and also this kind of focus on healthcare. While we know with the lens of planetary health equity, the health is a much broader concept, right? However, I think that declaration was a very good step forward compared to, you know, the absence of acknowledgement of the connection between climate and health that we saw in previous years. So that was really important as a first step. And I think the good thing of that declaration is there were things in there that could be really leveraged to link with other declaration and other commitments that country made last year. So you mentioned the transitioning away from fossil fuels, and quoting from the global stock take was transitioning away from fossil fuel in the energy system in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. Which, you know, yes, it's quite broad. Yes, we know that's all the caveats around that we wanted more than that. But in a way, if we link it back to the Declaration on Health, when it was about, you know, maximizing health gains and also prevent worsening health impacts, then we see how, you know, the work we do with the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, really, you know, we can leverage those words to say, yes, like if you want to achieve those maximization of health and prevent more ill health to occur, then you have to focus on transitioning away from fossil fuels. There's no way around, right? So I see the opportunity there to really leverage those commitments that country made, those declarations that were made last year, to push at the national level, and then obviously in this kind of international forums like COP to, you know, progress towards that direction. Said that, I agree with Cynthia, obviously, that we see this kind of tendency of wanting to, you know, do the bare minimum to see that there's some change, but not to change too much, because that will challenge the system, right? And I think when I think back at last year, one of the interesting things is that Bill Gates, for example, was really prominent in that forum, in his, you know, personal capacity and his linkage with his foundation, and I think it was quite clear that he you know, made some commitments. Also, you know, money-wise, especially in the agricultural sector, that were really in line with the current type of economic system. So really about like developing innovations, the growth model. So we see also actors like, you know, private foundation really coming in, not to challenge the system, but to maintain that system. So even if they join in such declaration, or they back the declaration that were made by states, they still kind of, you know, they're benefiting from the current system, so that they're not challenging that kind of narrative. And yeah, we talked a bit more about this, and if people are curious, in a commentary that we published last year in the Lancet, where we really, you know, reflect on the bigger picture and what, you know, what would mean actually to have those commitments to become from rhetoric to actually reality. And so this kind of challenging the fabric of the system that creates the problems in the first place. So yeah, the economic system obviously being the big elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about in this kind of forum. And health, as I said, was a big step last year to have health recognized, but this year we know that we're, you know, 10 steps back, and health has not be given a specific day, is actually being incorporated in a thematic day that includes human development, children and youth, and education. So, sometimes it's funny to see this kind of programs at COP and to see what kind of topics are kind of put together. So we know the health will not be a big focus here, but I also think that we have to kind of look beyond the current COP and see, what can we work on to really make health more embedded into the discussions with this more planetary health equity approach, so more holistic way of health. And I think for us as the hothouse, we really look forward at potentially COP 31st, which will be potentially in Australia. And so, kind of trying to see what that would mean for us and our engagement as researchers with civil society in pushing a different narrative around health that we haven't really seen yet at COP. So yeah, I don't expect much in this kind of COP when it comes to health, but I'm still curious to see how health will be articulated or brought in the discussion and now around finance, because as Cynthia said, finance is central in this COP. That's, we know that's what they want to talk about, and that's like the main core of the discussions that this COP will have. So where health will come in and how and what kind of narrative we will see around that, I think that would be really interesting for us to reflect upon after COP. So that I really look forward to see. And so linking to that, I take the hat of the person asking the question now, and I would like actually to follow up a bit on what Roxy said earlier, because you really reflected upon one other declaration that came out of last year COP, which is the one on sustainable, resilient food system and climate action. So again, one of the first COPs where we saw a bit more focus on another important thing, which is food, and again, connected to health, a very, very, very important. And so I was wondering if you want to go a bit more deep in reflecting upon that declaration, but also what do you expect for this year? Food has a day, but, again, it's not really on focus, but, maybe you have some reflection about this year and potentially, the future COPs that are coming up in Brazil and hopefully Australia. So.
Thanks, Gio. Yeah, you put it out so beautifully, because foods also finally made it to the discussion table. And it was long due, even though it was a breakthrough. It's incredible that we don't discuss about agriculture and food systems even when we're considering greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3 of those emissions globally are coming from agriculture and foods. So having them recognized as critical components to achieving the Paris Agreement goals and also part of the solution is incredible. And just to bring a few numbers of why this matters, you mentioned this declaration on sustainable agriculture, on resilient food systems and climate action. This was endorsed by 60 countries. And these nations represent 68% of the world's farmers, 75% of global population, and 83% of global emissions from foods, 83% of the world's agriculture GDP. This is huge. This majority is huge. And there's no wonder why, when the declaration was signed, the two core aspects of that declaration in Dubai were focusing on funding. So again, finance, as you mentioned, funding and innovation. But then very interesting, we see partnerships. And I remember seeing, I think it was Bill Gates, he came up on stage, rightly full, and he mentioned, I want to help poor farmers and give them better tools. So there was a pledge of around $200 million in investing in those better tools for farmers. So what this declaration brings forward, what's new and relevant when we consider health, equity, good health of people in a stable Earth system, so the planetary health equity goals, is that food doesn't just have now a place and a platform within COP summits, but it was also integrated in other talks. For instance, in the global stocktake, which is this review of the progress that we have so far from the Paris Agreement. We see it in the global goal and adaptation. We also saw the launch of an alliance of champions on sustainable food transformation. This is a smaller group of nations that are even more ambitious, so they're pushing for faster progress. And also we have the FAO roadmap, the global roadmap on sustainable food systems. So what FAO wants to do is to transform the food systems in a way that both limits global temperatures and ends world hunger. One of these priorities are cutting methane coming from livestock by 25% and reducing food waste by 2030. But we also see some recommendations on biodiversity and regenerative agriculture. One of the contrasting, let's say, or the novel and a bit delicate innovations that are coming from these declarations are this invitation for non-state actors to join the discussion. So we have companies, we have cities, we have farmers, we have indigenous communities. All of these different stakeholders are invited to be part of the solution. And this is worrying to me for two reasons. The first one is that we already see an overrepresentation of corporate interests. Like Cynthia mentioned before, fossil fuel industries, they're so well vested and they have the resources needed to make the claims as they did before that there can be no energy security without oil and gas. And the same narrative is taking now forward by the food companies, these multinational and transnational corporations that are arguing for the very same thing. And they have all their lobbyists ready to continue with that narrative. So quite interesting, we have companies that are producing fertilizers, for instance. We have Bayern, we have Nutrien, we have the largest meat producer, JBS, part of that conversation. And all these ultra-processed foods producers, Danone, Heineken, PepsiCo, Unilever, Nestle. And very interesting, they want to make partnerships on regenerative agriculture. So everything that is revolving crops, crop rotation, chemical usage, fertilizers, water management, carbon sequestration, that's where their interest is focusing on. And I think this is problematic because the same kind of actors are calling for nations to scale up forms of finance that can include public, philanthropic, private sectors. They're very invested in blended instruments, public-private partnerships, and so forth. They want to make sure that agriculture and foods are included in these sectors. And also they're pushing, very interesting, for these two aspects to be included in the national adaptation plans, in the nationally determined contributions. So there's a very interesting cacophony of voices, and we're not very sure how will this translate and what kind of practice will result from that. Another point interesting to mention is the fact that WTO came up again, the need to scale up, I see Nick smiling, the need to scale up this multi-trading system and to reinvest in the World Trade Organization. And as you mentioned, Gio, as well as Cynthia and Nick, we see these economic models that are being sustained rather than challenged, even though there's so much proving that they're incompatible with climate objectives. So that's kind of in a nutshell what this declaration brings forth. And there are some expectations also that the loss and damage fund, for instance, will be operationalized. Finally, we want to see what happens with the progress on the carbon markets. There's a huge debate on Article 6 there with the markets, that how are we doing international cooperation, bilateral cooperation in a way that is not double counting, that problem of potential greenwashing there. There's some expectations on monitoring and accountability. If we increase transparency and accountability of how these metrics that are meant to reduce fossil fuel use, to reduce emissions, how are they standardized so they're more accurate? And again, the risk for greenwashing is decreased. And this private sector engagement, of course, what kind of interests are the corporations bringing in? What kind of position will they have? And I think this is very relevant to think about also future terms, because the next COP will take place in Brazil, COP30, and then afterwards potentially will be Australia. Already for Brazil, the host city Belém has been witnessing some important changes. Four major projects have already been launched. Some of them are focusing on foods. It's about the market and the value chain. Some of them are infrastructure. So the host cities have a dual role. They have both the pressure of hosting almost 200 countries, plus all the other non-state actors and their very different needs and interests, but they also have the opportunity to benefit themselves. So Brazil is having an important role next year. There's an expectation for indigenous communities, vulnerable communities to have a more vocal stance and a platform to raise their concerns. There are some expectations about rainforest restoration that will be at the limelight there just because of the position and the geographical role of the country. And then for COP31, it will be quite interesting to see if South Australia will be winning the bid. It officially started a feasibility assessment for Adelaide, if I'm not mistaken, and that went very well. Of course, playing host is not just about the organizational part and the structural part. It can also cement very well Australia's and the Pacific's role in this emerging net zero economy. It can galvanize federal government's green industry plans, and it can help prioritize issues of health and environment and social equity and put them on the agenda in a way that makes sense. So just having them already being acknowledged last year was important, but continuing that throughout the next 2 years matters just as much, because it will provide Australia with the right signal for the government to understand that these issues are interconnected and then require action. But just stepping aside from that and coming back into the present tense and the next COP, I remember that the Director General that is leading the organization of COP in Baku, Mr. Babayev, he mentioned that there are two aspects COP is focusing on: enhancing ambition transparently, and then enabling action. And this action should be enabled through climate finance and the loss and damage fund. And because climate finance and finance in general is such a central theme to COP, I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, Nick, and if you can expand more on what you think these mechanisms should look like for this climate finance to ensure a just transition.
Yeah, sure. I'm always happy to talk about finance and trade. I mean, I think the first major point is that there needs to be a dramatic scaling up of climate finance for both adaptation and mitigation. I mean, it's the last COP, we mobilized something like 85 billion in funding. There were several billion devoted to replenishing the Green Climate Fund. There was more money put towards the adaptation fund. There was the launch of the world's largest private market climate investment fund with about 30 billion under management. And those numbers sound large, but they have to be viewed, I think, in context of the challenge that we're actually facing, where, I mean, even relatively conservative estimates suggest that we're going to require something on the scale of $1.6 trillion annually through to 2030 in order to meet our targets. And a lot of that investment is going to have to occur in low and middle income countries that don't have the domestic capital available to actually do it. So that financing is fundamentally going to have to come from capital markets primarily located in the global north. And global energy finance can be broken into roughly three categories. You have capital markets that are made up of investment banks, corporate finance, private equity, hedge funds. Then you've got multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., the Global Environment Facility. And then you've got public bilateral financial institutions. Now, in terms of what the multilateral financial institutions they can do, I think it's actually relatively limited given the scale of the problem, because ultimately they're dependent on investments made by member states. Certainly the World Bank has announced that it's going to be scaling up its lending, but the World Bank, IMF, etc., simply don't have the financial firepower, I think, to meet the challenge. Public bilateral financial institutions, i.e. those institutions that are controlled by national governments, things like national development banks, various development finance institutions, export credit agencies, are distinct from the multilateral financial institutions and from private capital in that they're under the control of states, either directly or indirectly. And so that makes them, I think, effective tools for national policy. So they're not driven by international development agendas or shareholder interests per se. And again, they don't have the financial firepower on their own to solve this problem. They can certainly help the problem. They do have some firepower, but I think their most important role is catalyzing private investment, unlocking the trillions of dollars in private capital that will be needed to support the energy transition. And in terms of some of the measures that could be put in place to help this, one would be banning the involvement of all forms of private all forms of bilateral financial institutions in fossil fuel infrastructure as a kind of non-starter. And then second would be kind of taking the leash off them and letting them take risks. Because in order to catalyze private investment, they will have to underwrite some of the investment risk for private firms. I mean, that's a bit of a double-edged sword in that you're using public money to fundamentally subsidize the risk of private capital. The other side of it is you can then deploy that private capital. And third, I think there needs to be a concerted effort to ensure that any of these financial measures that are taken by national governments ensure that there's adequate support for developing economies. You know, we don't want to see a world in which we've just got France investing in Germany and the US investing in Canada, vice versa. That's not where the greatest energy demand is. That's not where the emissions are rising the most rapidly. I mean, if you look at most advanced economies, their emissions profiles are declining. So because investments are being made there. But for many developing economies, there's an enormous demand for energy as their economies grow. I mean, part of that's a function of their population growth. And failure to provide them with the necessary capital to put in place green infrastructure, I think, will result in carbon lock-in for those economies. Because if they can't build solar plants, take advantage of wind, hydro, etc., they will turn to fossil fuels. And that will lock them into a 30-year cycle of dependence on those fossil fuels. So it will be critical that capital is deployed to mitigate that. I'll just talk briefly about trade. I mean, trade, we may see something on green goods and services, reductions in tariffs, etc. But I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that the WTO in its current form is not built for action. There's deadlock in the negotiating context, there's deadlock at the appellate body level, and there are kind of really serious challenges to the current rules that underwrite the trade regime, including carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are basically carbon taxes on the import of goods, as well as the rise of green industrial policy. We've seen a variety of economies engage in this, the US, the European Union, etc., as well as Australia. And there's still a real question around whether or not those types of policies are actually compatible with WTO rules. I mean, my personal view is that we won't see very much happen at the WTO. The real action will take place in the context of plurilateral trade agreements, so agreements between like-minded countries. And the kind of fragmentation then into groups of like-minded countries, or the rise of climate clubs. I mean, there's already some evidence of this occurring. And that will probably be exacerbated by rising geopolitical tensions between the largest economic blocs, so the US and China, and increasingly the European Union and China. I hope that kind of answered that question.